All right, so now let's talk about the lipids. So lipids, as I mentioned earlier, these right here, let me spell that right underneath. These are the fats right here. And so it's funny because our cells, if you want to think about it as a skin, right? They're made out of fat basically. And so the reason I call it skin, it's known as the phospholipid bilayer, plasma membrane, a lot of different things, but basically I consider it the skin of the cell because it does what our skin does, and it protects the inside of our bodies from the outside environment. Right, so that's kind of what these lipids are doing, right, in our bodies. And so, whenever we eat lipids, right, too much fats are not good, but you definitely do need some of those to keep your cell membranes, this again, the skin of your cell, uh, there, right? Without that, then you wouldn't have like the basic building blocks for that. So we have this lipid structure right here, and the thing with the lipids that you see here, made up of two different parts. Here you'll see. Let me just label it for you. The head, which is kind of like this part that they circled in a little oval shape right here, and then over here. Let me just kind of square this up right here. And this part right here is what's known as the tail. All right, so you have the head and the tail. So let me just drag this up a little bit right there. All right, so this is what makes up the lipid itself, is the head and the tail. There's a few properties about the heads and the tails that are important, and we'll talk about that in a second. And so monomers are the basic units, right? Mono one, long chains of carbons called fatty acid tails, right? So here you see the C, 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 all the way across. Those are the carbons, and then the H's are the hydrogens, right? And so we'll see that in a little bit right now. Why the heads, the property of the head is special, and the property of the tails are special. And so the polymer, again, just a chain of monomers, right? These are the lipids themselves. And so here you see three tails in this lipid right here. And so this is what you would call a triglyceride, right? Tri means three, like tricycle has three wheels. A triglyceride has three tails. And here, this you will see the tail only has two, right? There's only two tails on this lipid. And so this one has two, this one has three right here. But again, you see the head up here and the tails here. Same thing over here. You see the heads right here. And then let me circle the tails in blue. All right. The same thing with this guy right here, tails in blue and the head in red. Right, so here you have the lipid structure. And this is funny because lipids will pack tighter if they're straight like this, right? So if you think about fats, think about like a butter, right? Butter is kind of shaped like this. And it makes sense because butter packs in tighter. And so that's why it becomes like solid at room temperature, right? And butter is not very healthy for your heart, right? Because eventually, if you get enough of these just kind of clogging your arteries, it's not going to go well for you, right? And so these become like solids at room temperatures. These guys over here, these unsaturated fatty, so these are called saturated, right? And it's saturated with hydrogens, a lot of hydrogens there. This unsaturated fatty acid, the tails are not straight, right? They're kind of curved like that. And so what happens is when you get a bunch of these together, it's kind of like a liquid oil. So these kind of stay liquid at room temperature, and these become solids at room temperature. So think of like butter over here or lard, and then think of oil like corn oil, vegetable oil, those olive oil. And so here you see again the head and the tail. And so this is what I was saying earlier, y'all, is that there is special properties for the heads and the tails. The properties of the lipids are caused, again, by these saturated and unsaturated fatty acid tails. If they are saturated, then that means that these are going to be like solid at room temperature, like butter and lard and things like that, a bacon grease, right? But if you have something that is unsaturated, like the second one right here, this is unsaturated, and because it has these curves right here, the structure of that means that it's going to stay liquid at room temperature, right? So corn oil, vegetable oil, olive oil, what I just said a little while ago. But the really cool thing about these, y'all, is that the heads have special properties, right? The heads are polar, which means they're hydrophilic. If you see this word right here, hydro, we talked about that already earlier. Hydro means water, right? And philos right here, this part that where philic comes from, philos means a love, right? So this guy right here loves water. So if you're a hydrophile, that means you love to swim, you love to be a water, you love everything about water, right? But over here you have nonpolar. And nonpolar is just kind of the opposite. Whereas hydro means water, phobic right here may sound familiar. If you have a phobia of something, it means you have a fear of something. So basically, the heads love water, but the tails do not, right? The heads are hydrophilic, they love water, tails are hydrophobic. Another way of saying that, y'all, hydrophilic means polar, hydrophobic means non-polar, right? So that's just kind of another way of saying that. And so let's see why that's important, though. This is why it is important right here, y'all. You have up top let me choose a color. I think that red, it will not show up with red. So here you have the heads, right? I'm kind of like circling them in green right here. So these right here are hydrophilic, right? These are the heads. Hydrophilic, again, means polar. And I can even write that over here. I forgot how to spell for a second. Hydrophilic is equal to polar. Oops, not polar, polar. And then when we get down here, we're going to talk about hydrophobic in a little bit. Hydrophobic is just non-polar. Right, so they kind of mean the same thing right here. Whoops. Right, and so the heads over here, you can see they're hydrophilic, and that means they love the water, which makes sense, right? Because you see right here, I'm kind of highlighting them in green, but also down here, these are also the heads right here in green. And what is it that these green hydrophilic heads are in contact with? Water, right? The heads are touching the water. But what about these tails right here, right? So let me go ahead and put these tails here in blue. So these are the tails in here. And it looks like these have two tails, right? So there are two tails right here, two tails right here. But what you notice right here is that all the tails are kind of tucked up inside right here, right? They're all kind of hiding from the water. And that makes sense because, again, the tails are hydrophobic, which means they don't want to be anywhere near that water, right? So if you throw a whole bunch of lipids inside some water, they're just going to kind of take this shape right here, this sphere, this ball shape. And that's what our cells look like, right? They're made of those things. And again, that's why I kind of call this the skin of the cell. It's called the phospholipid bilayer, plasma membrane. There's different names for it, but kind of the skin of the cell, right? Because it's separating the inside of the cell from the outside of the cell. And so let me move these scribblings down here. And so they make up the cell membrane, providing the cell structure, right? So again, giving some protection, but also giving the cell some structure, right? It's spherical shape. And so it actually does provide some long-term storage too, right? Lipids are fats. And if someone is overweight, or I guess not even overweight, right? Just even a healthy weight. But when people, and I don't know if you've ever seen these shows, like these survivor shows where they go on these islands and they try to survive for a long period of time. I've seen some of these shows where the strategy for some of these people is just to get really, really overweight before going onto this show. Because what happens is the fat, it's long-term energy storage, right? So some of these people, and it worked. The strategy worked for a couple people. I forget what show it was, Lone Survivor or something like that. And that's what they did, is they just ate a lot before they went out there, and they were overweight when they got onto the island. But by the time they left, they were a lot skinnier, right? And that's because all of that fat was long-term energy storage. And so that was usually the biggest thing, is they couldn't find food on these islands. So eventually they would just quit because they were growing dangerously hungry. And so, because of the fat, right? It was long-term energy storage. And so when you do go a long time without eating, that's like the first thing to go is your fat reserves, right? And then after that, it kind of starts eating away at your muscle. And so, yeah, that's wise, because fat stores energy for long terms. And so it provides insulation. The fat keeps the body warm, right? And that's so like things like whale blubber and animals that live like really far up north, they usually have thick layers of blubber around their body, like penguins and things like that, because it helps insulate their body, right? And even in countries where it's cold, right, it's always beneficial for people to keep a little bit of a layer of fat on them to keep them warm, right? And even people who are a little bit more overweight tend to run at hotter temperatures than people who are really like skinny, right? So it does provide that insulation. And so, as you might have guessed, fatty foods contain lipids, right? The more oils and fats and things have, the more lipids they have. And so lipids are found in things like meat and fish and oils, avocados, eggs, nuts, right? All of these things have oils. They all have lipids, right? Fish, and it all depends. Some things have more lipids than others. Fish usually not a whole lot, right? They're more lean and things like that. But other meats do sometimes have like thick layers of lipids, of fat on them. Right. And so here you kind of see examples of that. Again, oils will kind of have those like curved tails, and things that are more solid at room temperature, like butter or lard, those their tails are straight. And so they can pack themselves in tighter. And that's what causes that solid structure. Right. If their tails are like kind of bent, then they can't really um, compress themselves, like push themselves in, smush themselves in. So because of that, they're a liquid at room temperature. Remember from chemistry, all of you remember that usually solids are more compressed in their molecules, and then liquids are more spread out a little bit. Right, so now we're going on to the proteins. These proteins, y'all, these are making up a lot of parts of our body, right? The proteins, as I mentioned earlier, hair, nails, muscles, hormones, enzymes, all of these things are proteins. And our proteins, right, so to build those proteins in our body, we need the basic building blocks for proteins. And in this case, the basic building block or the basic unit or the monomer is called an amino acid. Right, so amino acids are kind of like the monosaccharide that we saw, or like the fatty acid tails that we saw. They are the basic unit, the basic building block, the monomer. Right, so for proteins, we have amino acids. And we have 20 kinds, different kinds of amino acids, which is pretty cool because those 20 different kinds do so much for our bodies, right? They are all over the place when it comes to like what we do as living things. And so the polymer for this is going to be a protein, right? And a polymer is just a long chain of these monomers. And so when you see this right here, this is amino acid structure, right? The hydrogen, you have the amino, the carboxyl, and then this changes for pretty much every amino acid. The different amino acids have different R groups right here, right? But these are usually the same for all of the amino acids. These are the ones that change, right? So here you see dipeptide. Di means two, right? There are different ways to say two. Bi means two, di means two. In this case, it's dipeptide, which means that these things right here. So let me kind of point this out really quickly. Amino acids are linked by peptide bonds, right? And so here you see this peptide bond right here. Here you see this peptide bond right here, peptide bond here. Remember, y'all, a bond is just a connection, right? If you have a bond with someone, you have a connection with someone. Same thing with these. This Y amino acid is bonded to this A amino acid. This A amino acid is bonded to this H amino acid, and so on, right? So amino acids are linked together by peptide bonds. And once you get like a long group right here of peptide bonds, you can also call these polypeptides. And let me kind of move this up a little bit right here. So poly means many, and peptides are these bonds that are holding them together. So basically, a polypeptide is just kind of this long chain of amino acids together. What you're going to see is this is kind of the beginning of a protein. The beginning of a protein is this polypeptide, but usually proteins are made up of like 2, 3, 4 polypeptides all together, and then they fold in a certain specific way. And so a polypeptide is just a beginning of a protein, right? These proteins you can see are long chains of amino acids. So dipeptide because there's two, but polypeptide because there are many right here that you see, right? And so that's what it is, y'all. The amino acid is the monomer. And again, this one right here, so let me just kind of point this monomer. This is a monomer, this is a monomer, this is a monomer, this one is a monomer. These are all monomers, right? But when you have them all together right here, this is the, let me spell that out with this polymer. And so again, it takes a few of these different polypeptides to make a protein. And so protein structure, you can see right here, the 20 amino acids, right? Some of these are polar, which again means hydrophilic. Others are nonpolar, which means hydrophobic. And so proteins can contain both kinds. And if something is polar, it usually mixes well with something that's polar and something that's nonpolar. Or well, let me phrase it this way because it might make a little bit more sense. Something that is hydrophilic uh, tends to mix well with something else that is hydrophilic. But something that is hydrophobic will not mix well with something that is hydrophilic, right? Think about oil. Oil is hydrophobic. Water is water is hydro, but think of water as like hydrophilic because it's polar. And that means that oil and water will not mix, right? They're kind of like opposite that way. One's hydrophobic, one's hydrophilic. And so this is what I was talking about, y'all. It's a polypeptide is like the beginning, right? So here you see amino acids, right? They put that right here, amino acid. And so this right here is going to be the monomer, right? Remember the amino acid is the monomer. Here you have it in blue. And then this guy over here, this long chain, this is what you're going to call the polymer, or you could even call it polypeptide. And this, at this case, it kind of mean the same thing right here. Right. But again, this is just the beginning of a protein. Sometimes protein polymers, polypeptides, they have to connect with other ones. It's not just one. Sometimes they will fold, right? Occurs when the sequence of amino acids are linked by hydrogen bonds. And so they kind of fold each other. They become sheets. They become spiral shaped, which are helical or helix, a pleated sheet and alpha. So they just take all kinds of shapes. But primary right here, we kind of saw this with primary consumer, secondary consumer. Primary just means this is the first step right here. Right. And then it becomes right here to the secondary step, or it comes to the secondary step. And then after that, it comes to this tertiary step. And then after that is a quaternary step. So basically, it's got to go through a few different stages before it can go from a polypeptide to an actual full-blown protein. Right? Proteins have this complex structure. The shape of protein determines its function. And so an example of this is like hemoglobin, right? Hemoglobin, and here's a little hint for those of you who like biology going into that, or have a test coming up or something. Whenever you see the whenever you see the letters like this, IN, a lot of times that is going to signify that it's a protein, right? Hemoglobin, pepsin, trypsin. I can't really think of a whole lot right now, but IN is kind of a hint that it is a protein. But anyways, hemoglobin, what it does is it carries blood around, oxygen around your blood. Sorry, and it has kind of like a bowl shape type of thing or cup shape, so it can carry that oxygen. If that is protein is misshaped, then it cannot successfully carry oxygen around, and then people have problems breathing because that oxygen is not carried throughout the body. So proteins serve all kinds of functions, right? They do so many things in our body. They build and repair muscle and tissues. Again, that's a no pain, no gain. That's what I was saying. Like people that lift weights, they need to eat a lot of protein so that your body breaks it down and then builds it up as muscle. Enzymes are proteins that speed up chemical reactions. So with enzymes, some reactions will take like seconds. Without those enzymes, some of them could take days, weeks, or even years without these enzymes. But luckily, we have these enzymes in our body that speed things up. Without them, we would not be alive. Right. And so here you go with that no pain, no gain muscle milk. And something I actually used to use that stuff back in the day when I worked out a lot. But yeah, it's protein, right? If you work out, then you're probably going to need some extra protein. And so here you see those enzymes, y'all. This is what enzymes do is they basically, if you're thinking about like you want two people at a party to interact with each other, but they're not interacting with each other, the enzyme is kind of like a person that goes and grabs those two people and holds them together until they interact with each other. Right, that's kind of what you see happening right here. In I guess this example right here, I'm talking about two different things and turning them into one. But this is showing you the reverse. You take one thing and you can break it up into two, right? So people maybe that they don't want to break up at the party and you just kind of separate them. So that's kind of what an enzyme is. It's a catalyst, y'all. And a catalyst just means that you speed up a reaction, right? If you're the catalyst for the party, that means when you show up, you get that party going. And so you can find in proteins, you find proteins in meat, fish, legumes, nuts, grains, soy products. There are 6 amino acids that our bodies cannot make. We can only get these from food, right? So proteins are very, very important for your body. And you see some of these things are the same as lipids, right? Because lipids, meats, some of these fruits and vegetables, these contain fats and proteins at the same time. Right, remember, y'all, all these things have cells too, like us, and a lot of their cells are very similar to our cells. Now you have the nucleic acids. Nucleic acids, and let me go back right here. You can think of these guys as DNA, RNA, and ATP. And we'll talk about these in a second. But DNA is just basically the blueprint that makes a living thing. RNA is what helps that happen. And then ATP are these little molecules that release energy when they're broken up or broken down. Right, so nucleic acids are made up of monomers, just like everything else we've been talking about. The monomers are the basic units, and the polymers, again, are these long chains. So the monomers for nucleic acids are known as nucleotides, right? And these nucleotides, they are the basic building blocks, right? And the polymers, the chains that these nucleotides make up, are DNA or RNA. ATP isn't listed here. We're not going to go into a lot of detail about that yet, but it is considered a nucleic acid. Right, and the thing that makes up these nucleotides are phosphate, a phosphate, a sugar, and a nitrogen base. But right here, we'll just call it a base. And here you see there's the nitrogen-containing base, the sugar, and then the phosphate group. Later on, when we learn about DNA in more detail, we'll go into more detail into these things right here, these parts that make up the nucleotide. And here you see DNA and RNA. DNA is this double-stranded molecule right here, and RNA is just this single-stranded molecule right here. This, again, is what we have in all of our cells, most of our cells, that is a blueprint for living things for us. And then this RNA is kind of like it's like the builder and the factory where this DNA turns into a living thing, basically. Or yeah, we'll talk about that later. And so the nitrogenous bases, y'all, if you've ever heard of A's, T's, C's, and G's when you're talking about DNA, this is where they come from. Adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine, right? And whenever DNA is kind of based up like this, usually and you see right here, A, T, C, G, that is the adenine, thymine, cytosine, guanine, right? So that's what they're talking about. And usually when you have this, like you'll have what you call complementary bases. A always lines up with T, and G. Sorry, I did not put that in the right place. A lines up here with thymine, and guanine always matches up with cytosine, right? And so that's kind of what you see right here. If this was an adenine on this side, whoops, I'm kind of move it over here. Then on this side over here, you would have thymine, right? A with T. And then over here, if you had cytosine, let me put a C right here, right there. Then on this side, you would have guanine. That's all complementary base pair means is A's go with T's, adenines always line up with thymines, and cytosines always line up with guanine, right? A's with T's, C's with G's. Yeah, someone said ashtrays, garbage cans, apple tree, car garage, whatever it is, it's going to help you remember that. Just remember, they always line up that way. A with T and G with C. And here you go, right? And again, y'all, there's a lot of repetition in this, but that is to your benefit, right? So adenine will always line up with thymine. Guanine will always line up with cytosine. The sides of the ladder are the sugar phosphate, what they call the sugar phosphate backbone, right? So this blue part right here is a sugar phosphate backbone. These guys right here are the nitrogenous bases. Whoops, let me not do that because I'm kind of confusing. I may confuse you with that. So this green and this red are the nitrogen bases, and you can see right here, smooth this down, right? The A's are the T's, sorry, the red ones are the thymine, the green ones are the adenine, the purple is the guanine, and this greenish, light green is a cytosine, right? So an A will always be with a T. You will never see them lined up any other way. And then these guys right here in the middle, these are hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bonds are very, very weak. Well, they're weak, so it allows this to split up eventually when it has to, because it's going to have to later. But for now, it holds them together quite well. So, it does its purpose, but it's not a very strong bond right here, these hydrogen bonds. Kind of the same thing you see right here, A with T, G with C. You'll never see a T with a C, or you'll never see a G with an A. It's always AT, GC. And then right here, you see the hydrogen bonds. And then these guys, again, are the sugar phosphate backbones. So the nucleic acid function, it stores and carries genetic information, right? It's everything that you inherited from your mother and your father is stored in those DNA molecules, right? And so, yeah, all that information is right there. And it's basically just a blueprint to create a living thing. And it's passed down from the parent to the offspring. And the offspring is basically just the child of a parent. And so we get nucleic acid components from vitamins, minerals, things like that, right, that are in our diet. These, in turn, come from fruits, vegetables, grains, meats. So basically anything that was living at one point or is still alive when you eat it, it's got DNA in it, right? Like it says here, not junk food, right? So if you're eating Cheetos do not have nucleic acids, they don't have DNA, but the plants that made the Cheetos, right, they do. And so again, all these living things or things that were once living have DNA. And so when you eat something, you eat their DNA too. So when biomolecules are eaten, so this is the digestion, eating things and then building them back up. When biomolecules are eaten, they're digested and broken down into their subunit monomers. Right. So when you're talking about your metabolism, some people are like, oh, I have a really fast metabolism. Some people not so much, right? Whenever you're talking about your metabolism, y'all, that's basically just building up and breaking down, right? That's what happens when you eat. You break things down and then your body builds them back up wherever it needs to, right? So if you want to think about it like if you want to think about an analogy, it's taking apart an old brick building, right? Inside the cells, these subunits are reconstructed into the biomolecules we need. And so that's why I was saying, like a bodybuilder, if you need to build a lot of muscle, you need to eat a lot of protein so that your body can break down that chicken or that fish or whatever proteins you're eating and to amino acids, and then it builds those back up into where you need them, right? As your muscles, like it says here, using bricks to build a new building. And so here's some digestion products, right? Whenever you have the biomolecule and you eat carbohydrates, you break it down into simple sugars, right? Or glucose. When you're eating lipids, you break those down into fatty acids and glycerol, and then glycerol further is broken down into glucose. When you're talking about proteins, like I was just saying, you eat those proteins and you break them down into amino acids. Then when you have nucleic acids, when you eat those, right, the DNA of other living things, then you turn those into nucleotides.